you hear the difference on Radio 786, 100.4 FM. In studio, we have Nick Padlender, researcher at Indifuno Kwazi, and Uncle Bevel Lucas from Reclaim the City. We're speaking about housing and the waiting list that we have now established is non-existent. This is the weekly show, lately in land and housing, which discusses current affairs in political landscape pertaining to housing, evictions, and so on. Our lines are open. You are welcome to share your questions and your thoughts with us. Nick, before the break, you were speaking about Kailija being, Kailija can be considered a city if they wanted to, but it's not, I don't want to say it's not so much a hopeful city, but just the way the infrastructure is, just the way people are taking what Uncle Bevel said, the measures into their own hands because they need to survive. You then say the waiting list is a myth, something that officials are using to beat down people and sort of, guys, you're on the list, so it's fine. Don't worry, we're going to get to you, but there's nothing happening. So talk to us about this waiting list and why it's been used to sort of keep people in this continuous cycle of oppression.
Yeah, sure. So, I think the waiting list is a very kind of attractive concept for people to buy into because it makes you think that housing allocation is very rational and it all makes sense, and the person who waits the longest or the person who deserves the house the most will get the house. But actually, that isn't the way that housing allocation works in South Africa at all in practice. If any level of government builds a housing development, yes, they will pull people off the general housing waiting list, but they'll also likely have to take a certain percentage of people from the local area and maybe a certain percentage of people who are, families where a member has disabilities or a certain number of child-headed households or single-parent households, etc. So in one way already that throws the list into a bit more of a random situation. Then, of course, there's a lot of corruption in housing allocation and a lot of contestation about who gets homes that are delivered. So I think, when you look between those two forces, I personally know people who have been on the housing waiting list for 30 years, and there are other people I've met who are on the waiting list for 5 years and got a home. And if you speak to any housing activist in Cape Town, they will have very similar stories for you. And which is why none of us really believe that it functions in that way. And actually, if you look at the city's own policies, if you follow the processes for different developments of how they get tenants or how they get residents, you'll see, again, that this isn't some sort of logical process that starts with the person who's been waiting the longest time. There are a range of different kind of somewhat chaotic factors that influence who gets a home when. So that's one reason why the waiting list is a bit of a myth. And another very big reason is that the waiting list kind of implies that if you sit and you wait, then your house will come, right? And that our housing system functions in such a way that we are providing homes each year and that we are providing more homes each year than there are people who need housing. But it's actually the opposite of that. We provide way too few homes each year to cut into the housing backlog. As I said earlier, across the whole of South Africa, but you see it very clearly here in Cape Town and the Western Cape, the number of homes delivered by the government declines every single year. And if that's the case, and if the private market is too expensive for for 3/4 of the population to access, then again, this whole idea that if you sit patiently and you wait, your turn will come, kind of crumbles into the quicksand that it is in a sense. It's not... Yeah, it isn't something that is so solid and so clear and so rational as it is presented.
I think what must be said, there may have been a time in our history where the waiting list was an adequate measure of a determination who should get and where and when. But I think what has subsequently happened is that as that list expanded, it became far more difficult to manage. I think one of the challenges for post-apartheid South Africa state was that it had to integrate all these lists if there was a true list, particularly in the black communities, which was largely migrant, but who also under apartheid was never intended to be permanent residents in our city. And so you then have a situation where the post-apartheid government had to manage and to navigate its way with these lists. But as a result of that, it became very clear that this would be a task almost impossible. And so the best way then is to ignore it, do what we can, fiddle where we can fiddle, and let's look at what we can justify about our fiddling. But look at the crisis that it had compounded, because there was no real alternative to be created, and the lack of creativity by a post-apartheid state also contributes to how best and fairly to consider those who have made application for state housing to be provided with that. I think you can clearly see how social housing functions, where people hear of a development taking place and try to inquire about how do we get onto the list to be considered. And so all the elements that have to be taken into account has now been handed over to the social housing company. And they, in turn, will then determine who qualifies and who will not qualify, who they will consider and who they will not consider. So you have a situation where the allocation of whom that housing may be necessary for has been outsourced. And with that happening, it opens itself to corruption and all kinds of stuff, and then leaves the most vulnerable exposed to whatever kind of decision may be made somewhere, either by the municipality, either by local government, by provincial government, or even by national government, as well as the social housing companies. So it's a situation where there hasn't been clear thought, there hasn't been a new approach to how housing can be fairly and adequately distributed to those in need.
So, I mean, yeah, just to, completely agree with that. I think that it neither of us are sitting here again kind of pretending that it's simple, right, to administer something like a housing waiting list. It's incredibly, incredibly complicated, exactly for the reasons as Uncle Bevel outlined. And, we should also acknowledge that there were times in our history where the government was building a lot of housing. We delivered about 3 million free homes overall in South Africa, which is a big achievement. Unfortunately, a lot of that housing was built in very peripheral areas, which meant that people didn't have access to jobs and schools and hospitals and everything you need to kind of really improve your life. And some of it was of a low quality. But the fact of the matter remains that the housing list isn't this sort of rational, simple thing, where whoever waits the longest gets the home first. And because of that, it's actually quite dishonest to use it as a stick to kind of beat people with who do occupy land or who do take matters into their own hand, kind of trying to say that they are jumping the queue or disadvantaging other people, when that isn't necessarily the case.
There's a few messages that came through. This one listener saying, "Hi all, my mother-in-law is on the waiting list for 30 years. They call her and they have a house. She goes in the office and then they don't get back to her again. It's a whole up and down thing all of the time. She goes and follows up monthly, but then they say it's in the process." Hashtag the waiting list doesn't exist. Another one says, who's responsible for the Western Cape housing problem? Is it a provincial government? Is it the provincial government or national government? And the other listener is saying, truly, the housing waiting list is really false. 63 years old, no home. How can people younger than me get homes? I'm on the waiting list for 17 years.
Yeah. I think there is some form of confirmation about what we are talking about, the challenges, but also the manner in which the housing list is used, is made to be seen as a tool to effectively try and to deliver some form of housing. I clearly want to believe that we probably need to be saying to the authorities in no uncertain terms that this notion of the housing list, we must do away with it, and that we as citizens of this city wish to participate in a process that can arrive or draft a more fairer process to enable people to access housing. It can't be justified in our city that people have to wait over 30 years and that some younger people are able to acquire these state housing faster and better than more of our elderly citizens. That clearly displays the elements that we're talking about, how improper this notion of the housing list is.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely agree with that once again. But just onto the question of who's responsible in Cape Town, I think it's an important question. You get that a lot. So in general, how it's meant to work is that it's meant to be a mixture of all three spheres of government. They're meant to do some of their own housing projects, but largely their role is in collaborating with each other. It's meant to function that national government provides the grants and the policy, and then in most places, it's the provincial government has the biggest share of responsibility for housing delivery. But in Cape Town applied and was granted something called accreditation, which means that actually the housing function is largely responsible for is largely the responsibility of the city of Cape Town. So they have much more responsibility than some other municipalities, but it means they also have access to better resources, more control over how grants are used. So all three spheres of government are meant to collaborate with each other and work together, and they all have some important role to play. But in the Cape Town context specifically, the city of Cape Town is largely responsible for the housing function.
Maybe just to say something within that regard, whilst it may politically have the responsibility, the city adopts the approach that it is an enabling institution to provide for the delivery. It's the private sector that will deliver and not the city. And that's an indication of the kind of policy and political approach that we have to contend with within the city, that it sort of outsources the responsibility and does not even want to engage with communities that are affected by that approach. By farming out, you think that is how you give interpretation to your responsibility. We are very clear that the responsibility is one to ensure effective delivery, and that engagement between the communities and the city is empirical. That unless we begin to accept that responsibility, the longer the delay, the bigger the crisis.
Another listener just said, Salams, I've been on the waiting list for 20 years and flats is standing open for more than 3 years, and I've been battling with the city to acquire one of the flats. So there is vacant land and vacant spaces for people should the government want to start this process. And I do want us to really get into solutions, and I'm sure this is an ongoing conversation because you can't provide all of the solutions now. But I want to ask, can you bring comfort to these people, like 20 years, 30 years, 17 years? And if you say a younger person who hasn't lived too long, doesn't know the struggle, comes in and says, okay, I'm applying for a house. And this is not to discriminate against young people, but if there is a waiting list and people have been waiting for many years, then we should, think as Uncle Bevel was saying about those who need it first right now, and then cater to every unique need, if one could put it that way.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a very difficult thing in terms of, what level of comfort we can provide to these callers, because if I'm perfectly honest, and this is a sad thing to say, I don't say this lightly, I don't have a massive amount of faith in our government to actually pursue this with the necessary urgency. I think housing is receiving less and less priority each year that goes by. I mean, what I would say is to try and, anyone that's in this situation, try and keep a very good record of every time you speak to anytime you interact with the government about your house, anything they say to you, keep all of your records, keep all of your papers, really, protect those, try and make copies of those, because that's another tragic situation that sometimes comes up because of the kind of disorganization of the housing waiting list, is that people will come to the organization I work for looking for assistance, but then they will have perhaps lost certain key documents or certain evidence that they need to really kind of try and force the city. So, I mean, I'll just very, very quickly plug that at Ndifuna Ukwazi, which is the organization that I work for, we do have a housing clinic. The housing clinic mainly deals with eviction issues. So if people are facing evictions, then they can come to the offices at certain times and receive some advice. But, if somebody has been clearly discriminated against in this housing allocation process or with anything to do with the waiting list, and we can find a legal avenue to help, then we will try. So you can find us on, you can just go to our website and find our contact details there. The details of the housing clinic are also listed.
I'm of the view, in addition to what Nick is saying, I think people have not applied enough pressure on the local political representatives, our ward councillors, our ward committees. I'm of the view that the time has come to put the pressure there and to begin to ask the questions about what are you doing? By when can I expect whatever answer you have for me from you? I think the more we kind of try that approach, the more that becomes clear that we want to hold our public political representatives accountable to the respective communities that we come from. I think it would begin to show the political authorities that people are asking questions about the kind of democracy that we're exercising and the accountability to the communities that we claim to represent.
I mean, I think that's a much, much better answer, actually. I think that than the answer that I gave, which is that if you get organized and if you find other people in the same situation, you can apply pressure, and through that pressure you can have wins. I think, I really think that's a great answer in terms
I'm
of...
just thinking it's, we're speaking about democracy, post-apartheid, apartheid, and how we're trying to navigate. But I'm thinking at the same time, the government that we have, we've had more than 28 years, going 29 years of democracy where planning could have been put into place, and not just planning but action, So I'm not too sure what's happening, because there's no excuse for people being on the streets. When I hear these wonderful politicians speak about the city of Cape Town, it's a great city, of course, for the wealthy. For those Cape Townians who don't fit the class of wealthy, they have a different reality. And so how can we claim this great city if we can't even afford a room?
I take the approach of the castle. In the city centre, there's a structure that was a colonial structure. And the thing that I do is to say that there's one drawbridge that allowed who could come into the city and who was allowed to go out. And I make the comparison from that particular colonial approach to the approach that we have today from the political administration, that the policies that they have in place is exactly that. It makes the determination who can come in and where they're going to go and who must go out. So a new form of political approach about exclusivity comes into being precisely because of the policies which I want to argue is a continuum from the colonial period into apartheid, into post-apartheid.
I just want to just read this last message. So many messages coming in. But this listener is saying, can we please get organized under your guidance, please? So if you guys can speak to government, lay out your policies, and we can have action, I'm sure that thousands, if not millions of people will support you, because they're all waiting for some form of something. But we have like 3 minutes closing thoughts, gentlemen.
Yeah. Go for it, Uncle Bevel.
Well, I think, as the last person refers to getting organized, that is what is going to make the difference between a shift in not only government, public administration, but also in terms of accountability. I think the more we hold our public officials to account for their decisions and for their policies, the more difficult it will be for them not to implement a progressive policy that will not only be accountable but will deliver. Because that's the issue. Accountability is an integral part of getting them to deliver what is required to create this narrative of a true city for all, and not only a city for a minority within the city. We who build the city are entitled to be part of the making of the future of the city.
We who build the city are entitled to the making of the city. I think I can conclude the show with that. I think that was so powerful. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for speaking to us. More conversations about this, and hopefully more delivery, accountability and delivery. And this is like sort of us spoken at government. Government, please open the doors. But thank you so much for joining me this evening. That was Nick Badlinder and Uncle Bevel Lucas from Reclaim the City, and Nick is a researcher from Intufuno Nkwazi, speaking to us about housing and how the waiting list is a myth. And you can reach them on www.nu.org.za, or you can follow them on Facebook, and they have a Twitter page. They also have a WhatsApp or call number. It's 062-352-9372, and you can email them also. It's nulawcenter@nu.org.za or ntomb@nu.org.za. That's all we have from On the Couch. Up next is Reflections with Ayub Ali, so stay tuned for House and Home. But from me and the team, it's a warm assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم Assalamu alaikum and good evening. Welcome to On the Couch with me, Farida Rabi and Soki Nzinze. This is where you hear the difference on 100.4 FM. Now, the difference that you'll be hearing this evening is that On the Couch, together with Lately in Land and Housing, which is a weekly show that discusses current affairs in political landscape pertaining to housing, from evictions, equitable access to land, tenure, security. Today we will cover housing delivery, housing typologies, and an introduction to housing needs register, or the waiting list. Now in studio we have Nick Badlinder, researcher at Intufuno Nkwazi, and Bevel Lucas from Reclaim the City. Our lines are open for any questions and thoughts, so you can call us on 021-699-1786 or WhatsApp us on 0786 10 11 12. Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome back.
Well, thank you for hosting us once more. We think it's such an important part of people's lives in our city. And it's a daily activity that concerns thousands who lack adequate accommodation and have to sort of try and find means on their own. We live in a city which has not been very caring. And it does present a number of challenges, and we hope we can speak to some of that from our own experiences, not just thumbsuck, about what people are feeling and what people are actually expressing out there.
So let's paint the scenario. So the city of Cape Town is sitting with a staggering number of 365,000 applicants still waiting for housing. That's a big number. So where are those people if we have to imagine where they are and our city not being so caring?
Well, it's quite diverse. I mean, some have been able to get housed by family members. Some are living in backyards. Some are having to live with the reality of exorbitant rentals. I mean, many people who have been able to find rentals available in Woodstock are paying between 10,000 and 15,000 a month. And the only way a significant number of people are able to manage that is by having a lot of family who financially can support living. So you will have overcrowding precisely as a result of the high rentals. And it's not just in one particular part of the city, but right across. The delay by the city over the past years has just exacerbated that situation. The housing policy with regards to making it more viable for property developers, particularly in Woodstock Salt River, with gentrification, has literally squeezed out working class people. Right now, there's another huge monstrosity being proposed in Salt River once more, which again will put that community under pressure as to for who will this housing development be for and who will be able to access this housing development. The manner in which the city is dealing with housing, particularly for the low-income groups, is part of the real challenge, is part of the problem that we have to contend with, why we refer to the city as a very uncaring administrator and does not take cognizance of the reality. We do not know in what part of the planet our city authorities live, that they cannot realize the dire need and the crisis that we are facing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much worth highlighting, exactly as Uncle Bevel has said, that in Cape Town there is a massive mismatch between what most people earn and what housing costs. You know, we produce a lot of housing for households that earn more than 18,000 Rand a month, but very, very little for households that earn less than that. And that's, 3/4 of Cape Town's population. So I think, many people are forced to live in very sort of undesirable and undignified and difficult circumstances in informal settlements, in backyard housing, in all sorts of different scenarios. And ultimately, at the same time that the housing crisis is growing and the number of people needing help is growing, we've actually seen declining government housing delivery, both in Cape Town but across other provinces and cities as well. So we really are in the midst of a very profound housing crisis that actually affects a huge proportion of our city. Almost the majority of people in Cape Town in one way or another are affected by this crisis. And I think, that obviously needs a response from the government that kind of matches the scale and intensity of the issues that we're dealing with.
I'm just thinking, you said 3/4 of the population in Cape Town is not being catered to. Is that because of the decline, or is it just because we have become so accustomed to the lower income population to figure things out for themselves as we cater for those who can afford?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting question. So, I mean, on one hand, a lot of it has to do with Cape Town's history and South Africa's history, right? That we had a racist government for a very long time in apartheid and into colonialism, which only cared for the needs of a very, very small white minority. That meant that all of the money that was spent on, or the most of the money that was spent on housing and urban planning and everything else, went into a very limited set of areas that only actually catered to a small percentage of the population. And now, in post-apartheid South Africa, I think that in one way, it's a result of that legacy lingering on. But in another way, it's also caused by developments that have happened in democracy. The fact that housing delivery has declined so much, it means that people really struggle. And then also the formal property market just doesn't cater to the needs of most people. And that's why we see such dramatic growth in things like backyarding, in things like informal settlements, because people have basically no other options.
I think one of the huge challenges is located within policy. That we've almost got to have a new, what I want to refer to as a reconstruction and development plan, not program, that includes the communities that are to be affected by this situation. We have a huge migration population between the rural areas from all over the country into the Western Cape, even from across our borders into Africa. And if it was not for our our neighbors around the surrounding countries who provided shelter and protection for the liberation movement, we could still not have received that liberation. However, what happens in post-apartheid? We turn our back on our neighbors from those countries. We turn our back on our rural immigrants, economic immigrants into the city. And so when we look at what is to be done, it must be an inclusive approach, an approach that should take into consideration the different realities and the different challenges that we face. It cannot be that in the making of the Cape Town city in a post-apartheid South Africa, we still have these challenges and we still have an approach of exclusivity. It's now a new form of apartheid that is taking place. No more racial only, but economic also. And that can be addressed and it can be undone. But if there is the political will, we may find a solution. I'm not saying that every situation will be addressed, but I'm saying that if the political will is absent, it will make it so much more difficult to find the solution to these challenges, which will, if we don't make a real dent into the current crisis, it will just expand so much more and it could become far more problematic.
I mean, I just want to add to that. I think Uncle Bevel raises such an important point about urbanization and about the growth of Cape Town. You know, Cape Town is growing very, very fast. Urbanization is a natural force in cities all around the world as people move to areas where they think that they can look after their families better and have better access to jobs and hospitals and schools and all the other services. And Cape Town's growing very fast, partially because of sort of declining service delivery in other municipalities. But there needs to be a sort of a pragmatic plan for that. You know, what I was talking about earlier is kind of the failure of our housing system, that it doesn't cater to the majority of people, and that, you know, when people have no options available, they will try and find a way to make do. But, you know, instead, the way that it's framed and the way that it's framed in policy and in political discourse is as if our housing system is working, the government delivers some, the market delivers some, and somehow, you know, like if we just continue down this path, we will eradicate the housing backlog. But, you know, that simply isn't the case. And I think there needs to be much more of a sort of pragmatic reckoning with the fact that by and large, for most people, the housing system in Cape Town is failing and that it needs to be reorganized in a sense.
Uncle Bevel, you can go.
I think, where that is very starkly and clearly demonstrated is in the informal settlements that exist around our city. One of the challenges that existed under apartheid is that you had the migrant male dormitory flat system where families were not allowed to live together. Towards the end of apartheid, families forced the situation. Migrant workers brought their family and came to live with them, and that situation expanded. So, on the one hand, there was a need, and there was a political challenge to the order of the day that brought a particular response. And so, in post-apartheid, we then sort of still continue fumbling with the approach to what can be done and what may be possible. I think what you have is that because of the lack of the political will by government, both under apartheid and post-apartheid too, compounded the situation where people literally had to take the situation into their own hands and had to find a way to address the situation. So the occupations that you had emerging in post-apartheid South Africa was a direct response by people themselves to the crisis. And so because local government was not able to address it adequately and kept on shifting the goalposts, people had to take measures into their own hands. And as a result of that, it didn't take into account the geographical considerations which may have caused flooding and all kinds of other stuff, but purely as a way to address the dire need, people took up that challenge in the way in which they did. And lo and behold, what does the city do? It labels people as criminals and as invaders and all kinds of stuff. only to discover now in 2022 that one of its very own officials had to be dismissed for criminal activity, and still you want to lay claim and label those people who were forced to take matters into their own hands as criminals. Yet there is empirical evidence of the role and the conduct of its own officials that have now going to be very soon charged for criminal activity. Yet those who choose to take their own initiative to address the crisis are now labeled as criminals.
Uncle Bevo, I just wanted to ask, what was, for the listeners and myself to imagine, what did it look like for someone to take measures into their own hands in order for them to survive with such a crisis?
It's not easy. However, given the dire need that you face, you make those choices. And I think it must be extremely difficult for any human being to be faced with that situation. I know what the consequences might be if I do that. However, what alternative do I have? So I'd rather engage with an activity that may provide us with some form of shelter than not to. And whatever the consequences may be from the authorities with regards to what measures I have taken to provide myself and my family with some form of shelter, I would rather do that. The fact that I can tell you of a number of people who have waited for over 30 years on a waiting list to have some response from the local authority as to when will it be possible for me to get into some kind of formal housing or whatever form of housing, so that at least I minimize the impact, the threat of my family being rendered homeless. So I'd rather take that risk. But I think it's that which becomes absent in the political contour of how to address it. The fact that you have a political authority that has no compassion for human beings to be able to make choices to provide shelter for their families, it raises questions as to what type of political authority we are having.
So, I mean, I just want to add to that again, that basically when there are no housing options available for someone, either through what the government provides or through the private market, then they need to find a place to live, right? Just like we all need air to breathe and water to drink, we all need a home over our heads, a place for ourselves and our families. So people occupy land or they occupy buildings. And exactly as Uncle Bevel said, it's not, that neither of us are sitting here trying to argue that occupations are the ideal or that they're easy or that it's a choice that people make lightly. It's a very difficult choice, and it's often very, very difficult for people to live in that context. And very importantly, people do, as Uncle Bevel said, settle on land that's unsuitable, that floods, or that could be earmarked for sort of important infrastructure upgrades. But, going back to what we were talking about earlier, if the government was more kind of pragmatic and really acknowledged the scale of our crisis and really acknowledged, the kind of dysfunction of our housing system, then they would be doing things like saying, okay, and they would have been doing this for a long time, they would be identifying land that they own and saying, okay, we would rather people occupy this piece of land than another piece of land. And you call that sort of managed land settlement. Again, it's not ideal for people to occupy a piece of land that doesn't have access to services, that won't have, necessarily lighting and electricity and all of that. But if you are pragmatic about it, and if you realize that the story of Cape Town's growth is almost, the vast majority of that story is informal and unplanned growth as people occupy pieces of land. I mean, Khayelitsha now probably has at least 1 million people living in it, and parts of it were designated as housing by the apartheid government, but actually large parts of it were occupied by people who had no other choice, and yet we now view Khayelitsha as a legitimate suburb in its own right, as we should, because it is a legitimate suburb. But newer occupations that happen, all of a sudden the discourse is these people are criminals, they are invaders, and they're jumping the housing queue. And as I'm sure we'll get into a little bit later on, the housing queue is really a myth. There is no queue where the person that waits the longest gets a house the first. That's not how housing allocation functions at all. So, they use this kind of myth of the housing waiting list as a stick to beat people with, and as a stick to say, oh, you jumped the queue, you occupied land. But the city itself acknowledges that it'll take, at the current rate, it would take more than 70 years to eradicate the backlog. That's a lifetime of a person.
Yeah.
I mean, what are you meant to do in the 70 years? You just sit somewhere on your hands, out of sight, out of mind? I think that kind of disjuncture, exactly as what Uncle Bevel was picking up on, is such an important thing to kind of try and acknowledge and grapple with. And it's not easy. There isn't some sort of simple magical solution, but there are definitely things that could be done differently. And if there was a real kind of ethic of care, or if there was some compassion showed to the hundreds of thousands of residents in Cape Town who are having this experience, then I think we would have a different approach.
I definitely want to come back, but we need to take a short break. This is On the Couch on 100.4 FM, and we're speaking about housing, and maybe the housing list might not be actually true, but more on this conversation right after the break.